The silk of the wedding gown felt heavier than it should have. Elena Voss stood in the small stone chamber behind the great hall, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the guards outside the door could hear it. Today she would become the wife of Alpha Damon Kane, the strongest leader in the Northern Territories. Today, everything she had worked for since she was 17 years old would finally come true. 3 years. 3 years of proving herself. 3 years of standing beside Damon through pact disputes, through border tensions, through nights when he doubted himself, and she was the only one who told him the truth. She had earned this moment. She deserved it. Her hands trembled as she reached for the pendant that had belonged to her grandmother, the one piece of jewelry that was supposed to complete her wedding look. It was not on the table where she had left it. She frowned, glancing around the chamber, certain she remembered placing it beside the mirror that morning. There was no time to panic. The ceremony would begin in less than an hour, and 300 guests were already gathering in the courtyard beyond the hall. Pack members from 4 territories had traveled for days to witness this union. Elena smoothed the front of her gown, took a steadying breath, and decided the pendant had likely been moved to the dressing room where her cousin Ivy had been helping earlier that morning. She lifted the heavy skirts of her gown and walked quickly down the corridor, her bare feet silent against the cold stone floor. The dressing room door was slightly open, and light spilled out into the hallway in a thin golden line. Elena reached for the handle, ready to call out for her cousin, ready to ask about the missing pendant. Then she heard the laughter. It was Ivy's laughter, soft and familiar, the same laughter Elena had grown up with since they were children, sharing a bedroom in their grandmother's house. But there was something in the tone that made Elena pause, her hand frozen on the door. "You look beautiful in it," a man's voice said. A voice Elena knew better than her own heartbeat, Damon's voice. Elena pushed the door open before she could stop herself. The scene that greeted her would stay carved into her memory for the rest of her life. Ivy stood before the same mirror Elena had used only an hour earlier, wearing a spare wedding gown that had been kept in storage in case of emergency alterations. Her cousin's hair was loose around her shoulders, her cheeks flushed pink, and Damon stood behind her with his hands resting on her waist, his face reflected in the mirror wearing an expression Elena had never once seen him give her, not even on their best days. Tenderness. Genuine, unguarded tenderness. Neither of them noticed her at first. Ivy laughed again, and turned her head slightly, and Damon leaned down as though he might press his lips to her cousin's cheek. It was in that half-second, that suspended moment before the kiss landed, that Elena finally made a sound. Not a scream, not a sob, just a single sharp intake of breath that seemed to echo through the entire room. Both of them turned at once. Ivy's face drained of color so quickly that for a moment, Elena thought her cousin might faint. Damon's hands dropped from Ivy's waist, as though he had been burned, and he took a step backward, nearly knocking over a small table with an unlit candle resting on top of it. Elena. Damon said her name the way a man says a word he has forgotten the meaning of. "This is not what you think." Elena said nothing. She stood in the doorway in her own wedding gown, watching the 2 people she trusted most in the world stare back at her with guilt written plainly across their faces, and she felt something inside her chest go completely still. Not broken, not shattered. Still, in the way a lake goes still right before a storm arrives. "Elena, please, let me explain," Damon said again, moving toward her now, his hands raised as though approaching a frightened animal. "It happened once. It meant nothing. Ivy came to me last week, upset about something, and I comforted her, and things got confused, but I swear to you, I love you. I am marrying you today." "He is telling the truth," Ivy interrupted, her voice shaking. "Elena, I never meant for this to happen. I love you. You are my only cousin. I would never hurt you on purpose." Elena looked between the 2 of them, and for a moment, she almost laughed at the absurdity of the scene. Her cousin, wearing a wedding gown identical to her own, claiming she loved her while standing in the arms of the man Elena was set to marry within the hour. It was almost too strange to be real. But it was real. She could feel the reality of it settling into her bones like ice water. "How long?" Elena finally asked. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Neither of them answered right away. "How long?" Elena repeated, louder this time. 4 months, Damon admitted, his shoulders sagging. But Elena, it started before the wedding was even confirmed. I was going to end it. I swear, I was going to end it before today. 4 months. Elena did the mathematics in her head without meaning to. 4 months meant it had started around the time she had traveled south to negotiate a border treaty on Damon's behalf, spending 3 weeks away from the territory while he stayed behind to manage pack affairs. She had trusted him completely during that trip. She had come home with a signed agreement that secured peace with 2 neighboring packs, proud of the work she had done for him, for their future together. While she had been working to build their future, he had been building something else entirely with her own cousin. Elena turned her eyes to Ivy, who was crying now, tears streaking down her face and smudging the careful makeup that had been applied for the wedding. Elena remembered, with painful clarity, all the years Ivy had spent living in her shadow. Ivy's parents had died when she was young, and Elena's family had taken her in without hesitation. Elena had shared everything with her cousin, her room, her clothes, her secrets. She had never once imagined Ivy capable of something like this. "You helped me get ready this morning," Elena said quietly. "You fixed the pearls in my hair. You told me I looked like something out of a dream." Ivy's face crumpled further, but she said nothing. Elena felt the silence stretch between the 3 of them, thick and suffocating. Somewhere beyond the walls of the chamber, she could hear the distant sound of music beginning to play in the courtyard, the sound of guests taking their seats, the sound of a world that had no idea the celebration it was preparing for was already over. Damon took another step toward her. "Elena, please. We can still do this. We can still get married today. I will end things with Ivy completely. I will never see her again. I promise you." "Do not touch me," Elena said, and though her voice remained calm, something in the tone made Damon freeze in place. She had never spoken to him that way before. 3 years of partnership, of respect, of what she had believed was love, and this was the first time she had ever needed to tell him not to touch her. She looked at the gown she was wearing, the fabric that had taken 3 seamstresses 6 weeks to complete, the pearls sewn carefully along the bodice, each one selected by her own hands. She thought about how excited she had been that morning, how she had cried happy tears while looking at her reflection, thinking that finally, after everything, she had found a place where she belonged. That belief now felt like something borrowed from another person's life entirely. "Elena," Damon said again, and this time there was real fear in his voice. Fear of losing her, or fear of the pack discovering the truth before the wedding could take place. Elena could not tell which, and in that moment, she realized she no longer cared to know the difference. She turned without another word, and walked back into the corridor. "Elena, wait," Damon called after her, his footsteps following. "Where are you going? The ceremony starts soon." "Elena!" She did not answer him. She did not slow her pace. She walked past the guards stationed along the corridor, their faces showing confused alarm as they registered the look on her face, the tears that had begun sliding silently down her cheeks, despite her best effort to remain composed. She walked past the servants carrying trays of wine toward the courtyard, past the small children dressed in their finest clothes for the celebration, past everything and everyone who had gathered to witness what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. She reached the great doors leading out to the courtyard just as Damon caught up to her, grabbing her arm gently to stop her. "Please," he said, his voice breaking, "do not do this in front of everyone. Let us talk privately. Let me fix this." Elena looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up at his face. "You had 4 months to fix this," she said. "You chose not to." She pulled her arm free and pushed open the doors. The courtyard fell silent, almost instantly, as 300 pairs of eyes turned toward her. She could see her father near the front, standing beside the arch that had been decorated with white flowers for the ceremony, his face breaking into a proud smile that faltered the moment he saw her expression. She could see pack elders from 4 territories, dressed in their formal robes, whispering to one another in confusion. Elena walked down the aisle, but not toward the arch where the ceremony was meant to take place. She walked straight through the center of the gathered crowd, her wedding gown trailing behind her like a river of white silk, and did not stop. "Elena!" her father called out, rising from his seat. "Elena, what is happening?" She did not answer him either. She kept walking, past the last row of guests, past the edge of the courtyard, out through the gate that led toward the open forest beyond the territory borders. Behind her, she could hear the commotion growing louder, voices rising in confusion and alarm, Damon's voice calling her name over and over, but none of it reached her the way it should have. It all sounded distant, muffled, as though she were hearing it from underwater. She did not look back once. The forest path beyond the gate was one she had walked many times before, usually during quiet mornings when she needed space to think. Today it felt different beneath her feet, the ground colder, the trees taller, the silence heavier. She kept walking, even as the heels of her shoes sank into soft earth, even as thorns from low branches caught at the delicate fabric of her gown and tore small holes into the silk she had once considered so precious. She did not care about the gown anymore. She did not care about anything the gown represented. Somewhere behind her, she could hear Damon's voice still calling, though it seemed to be growing fainter now, as though the guards or the elders were holding him back from following her further. Perhaps they understood, in a way he did not seem to, that some moments required distance rather than pursuit. Elena walked until the trees grew thick enough to block out the sound of the celebration that had turned into chaos behind her. She walked until her legs ached, and her breath came in short, uneven gasps. She walked until she no longer knew exactly where she was within the forest, only that she was far enough away that no one from her old life could easily follow. Only then did she finally stop, sinking down onto a fallen log at the edge of a small clearing, and allow herself to cry. She did not know how long she sat there. The sun moved slowly across the sky above the canopy of trees, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the torn silk of her gown. At some point, her tears stopped, not because the pain had lessened, but because her body simply had nothing left to give. She sat in silence, staring at nothing, feeling emptier than she had ever felt in her entire life. She thought about her father, standing at the arch with pride on his face, watching his daughter walk away from her own wedding, without explanation. She thought about the elders, who had traveled so far to witness a union that would never happen. She thought about Ivy, her cousin, her sister in every way that mattered except blood relation through direct lineage, standing in a stolen wedding gown with tears on her face that somehow still felt less honest than Elena's own. Most of all, she thought about the 3 years she had spent believing she was building something real. A partnership, a future, a life with meaning and purpose beside a man she respected and trusted completely. All of it had been a lie hiding beneath the surface of every conversation, every quiet moment, every promise whispered late at night when she thought they were finally, truly close. Elena wiped the last of her tears from her face and looked around the clearing, noticing for the first time how far the light had shifted, how the shadows had grown long and cool. Evening was approaching, and she was alone in unfamiliar territory, wearing a torn wedding gown, with no plan and no destination in mind. She knew, somewhere in the back of her mind, that she could not stay in this forest forever. She would need to decide something soon, whether to return home and face the aftermath of what had happened, or to keep moving forward into the unknown, away from everything and everyone connected to the life she had just left behind. For the first time since she had opened that dressing room door, Elena felt something other than grief begin to stir inside her chest. It was small, and it was quiet, but it was unmistakably there. It felt like the very beginning of resolve. She stood slowly from the fallen log, brushing dirt and torn leaves from the ruined skirts of her gown, and looked toward the deepening shadows of the forest ahead of her. She did not know what waited beyond the borders of her old territory. She did not know what dangers or difficulties might come from wandering into unfamiliar land, particularly land that everyone in her pack had always warned her to avoid. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would not go back, not to Damon. Not to the pack that had watched her walk away without a single person stepping forward to stop her cousin from taking what belonged to her, not to a life built on foundations that had been rotten from the very beginning. Whatever came next, Elena decided, she would face it standing on her own feet, guided only by her own choices. She took a deep breath, lifted the torn hem of her gown, and began walking deeper into the forest, toward the setting sun, toward a future she could not yet see, but was determined to build for herself, no matter the cost. Behind her, far in the distance, she could still faintly hear voices calling her name, growing fainter with every step she took away from them. She did not turn around. The forest grew darker as the sun continued its slow descent, and Elena found herself walking without any clear direction, guided only by the vague sense that moving forward was better than standing still. Her feet ached inside, shoes never meant for walking such distances, and the delicate silk of her gown had become stained with dirt and streaked with small tears from branches and thorns along the path. She barely noticed anymore. The physical discomfort felt almost welcome, a distraction from the deeper ache that had settled into her chest since she had opened that dressing room door. She thought, as she walked, about the strange path her life had taken. She had grown up believing certain things about loyalty, about family, about love. Her grandmother had once told her that blood ties meant something sacred, that family was the one thing a person could always rely on when everything else in the world seemed uncertain. Elena had carried that belief with her, through every difficulty in her life, through the loss of her mother when she was young, through the years of proving herself worthy within a pack that valued strength and status above almost everything else. Ivy had been the one person, outside of her father, who Elena had never questioned. They had grown up sharing a room, sharing secrets, sharing dreams about the futures they hoped to build. Elena remembered nights spent whispering under blankets about the kind of partners they hoped to find one day, the kind of lives they wanted to live. She remembered comforting Ivy after the loss of her parents, promising her cousin that she would never be alone as long as Elena was alive to stand beside her. She wondered now whether any of those memories had been as genuine as she once believed, or whether Ivy had always harbored some quiet resentment beneath the surface, waiting for an opportunity to take what Elena had built for herself. The thought made her stomach twist painfully, and she pushed it away, unwilling to spiral further into questions she could not answer that night. As the last light of day faded from the sky above the trees, Elena began to understand that she needed to find shelter soon. The forest around her had grown unfamiliar, thick with trees she did not recognize, and she realized with a growing sense of unease that she had likely crossed some distance beyond the borders of territory she knew well. She had heard stories, of course, growing up within her pack, about the lands beyond their borders. Stories about rival packs, about dangerous creatures, about the neutral forests where disputes between territories were sometimes settled through combat. She had never imagined she would find herself wandering through those same forests alone, dressed in the remains of a wedding gown, with no weapon, no supplies, and no clear plan beyond simply continuing to move forward. A distant howl echoed through the trees, and Elena froze in place, her heart suddenly pounding. The sound was too far away to determine clearly whether it came from a wolf shifted into human form or an ordinary wild animal, but either possibility filled her with a fresh wave of fear. She had spent years around wolves, had grown up within a pack herself, but she understood clearly that the protection her status once offered had disappeared the moment she crossed unfamiliar borders, alone and unaccompanied. She began walking faster, scanning the darkening forest for any sign of shelter, any place where she might rest safely until morning. Her mind raced through possibilities, weighing the danger of continuing to move through unfamiliar territory in darkness against the danger of stopping somewhere exposed and vulnerable. Before she could settle on a decision, the sound of footsteps reached her ears, closer than the distant howl had been, moving steadily in her direction. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She pressed herself against the trunk of a nearby tree, trying to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible, though she understood on some level that the effort was likely useless. Whoever, or whatever, was approaching had almost certainly already caught her scent. The footsteps grew closer, and Elena could hear low voices now, speaking quietly to one another in tones she did not recognize. She strained to make out the words, but the language, though clearly some dialect of the common tongue spoken throughout the northern territories, carried an accent unfamiliar to her ears. A moment later, 3 figures emerged from between the trees ahead of her, and Elena felt her entire body go rigid with fear. They were clearly warriors, dressed in dark leather armor, marked with a symbol Elena did not recognize. A crest depicting a wolf's head surrounded by frost-covered branches. Each of them carried weapons at their sides, and their eyes, when they landed on Elena standing pressed against the tree trunk in her torn wedding gown, widened with obvious surprise. "Well," said the tallest of the three, a man with dark hair and sharp features, stepping forward slowly. "What do we have here?" Elena straightened her spine, forcing herself to meet his gaze despite the fear coursing through her veins. She had learned, over years spent within pack politics, that showing weakness rarely helped a difficult situation. "I mean no harm," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I am lost. I did not intend to cross into your territory." The three warriors exchanged glances with one another, and Elena could see suspicion mixed with genuine confusion on their faces as they studied her torn gown, her disheveled hair, the obvious signs that she had been walking through difficult terrain for hours. "You are dressed for a wedding," one of the other warriors observed, a woman with short blonde hair and keen eyes. "Yet you stand alone in our forest, miles from any pack territory we recognize as friendly." Elena hesitated, unsure how much to reveal to strangers who could easily decide she posed a threat, or worse, decide she made a valuable hostage or bargaining tool in whatever political disputes existed between their pack and others. "I left my own wedding," Elena finally admitted, deciding that honesty, however painful, seemed the wisest path forward. "I discovered something that made it impossible for me to continue with the ceremony. I have been walking since, without any particular destination in mind." The tall warrior studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "And which pack do you belong to, that you wandered so carelessly into Frostmark territory?" Elena's stomach dropped at the name. Frostmark. She had heard that name spoken many times within her own pack, always with tension, always with warnings attached. Frostmark territory belonged to King Cale Ashwood, the ruler her own pack, under Daemon's leadership, had been locked in conflict with for nearly a decade. Border disputes, resource disagreements, old grudges passed down through generations of leadership on both sides. She had walked, without any awareness of her direction, directly into the territory of her former fiancé's greatest rival. "I belong to the Northern Cane Pack," Elena admitted quietly, watching the warrior's expressions shift immediately at the mention of the name. The woman's hand moved instinctively toward the weapon at her side, and the tall warrior's jaw tightened visibly. "You are Alpha Kane's intended bride," the tall warrior said slowly, understanding dawning across his features. "The wedding was set to take place today. Word of it reached even our territory." Elena nodded, unable to find words to explain further. "Yet here you stand," the woman said, studying Elena with renewed interest now, torn and alone, miles from the ceremony that should have made you his wife by now. "I discovered his betrayal before the vows were spoken," Elena said, deciding there was no benefit in hiding the truth further. "I chose to leave rather than continue with a marriage built on deception." The three warriors exchanged another look, this one carrying a different weight than before. Elena could see something shift in their expressions, something that might have been sympathy, or perhaps simple curiosity, about how such information could be useful to their own king. "Our king will want to know of this," the tall warrior finally said. "Come with us. You cannot remain in these forests alone after nightfall. Whatever quarrel exists between our territories, we do not leave a woman to face the darkness unprotected." Elena hesitated, uncertain whether following three armed warriors from a rival territory represented wisdom or foolishness. But the darkness around her continued to deepen, and the distant howl she had heard earlier echoed again, closer this time, and she understood that remaining alone in unfamiliar forest offered no safety at all. "Very well," she said finally, straightening her shoulders and stepping forward. "Take me to your king." The warriors led her through the forest along a path she would never have found on her own, winding between ancient trees and across a narrow stream that glinted silver beneath the emerging moonlight. Elena walked in silence, her mind spinning with questions about what awaited her, about what kind of reception a king might offer to the abandoned bride of his greatest enemy. She thought of Daemon and Ivy, and the wedding that should have been taking place at that very moment, the celebration that had instead dissolved into chaos and scandal. She wondered what was happening back at the territory she had fled, whether her father was searching for her, whether Daemon had told the gathered guests some version of the truth, or whether he had constructed a different story entirely to protect his own reputation. None of it mattered now, she told herself firmly. Whatever happened next, whatever waited for her within Frostmark territory, She would face it as someone starting fresh, unburdened by the expectations and betrayals of her old life. As they walked further, the trees began to thin, and Elena could see the outline of a great stone structure rising in the distance, its towers catching the last silver light of the moon. Frostmark Castle, she realized, home to the king her own pack had spent years calling an enemy. She took a deep breath, gathering whatever composure remained within her, and continued walking forward into the unknown, uncertain what fate awaited her behind those ancient stone walls, but determined to face it without fear, no matter what came next. The gates of Frostmark Castle rose before Elena like something out of an old story, tall iron doors set into walls of pale gray stone that seemed to glow faintly under the moonlight. Torches burned along the ramparts, and Elena could see figures moving along the walls, guards watching the approach of their fellow warriors, with the stranger walking between them. The tall warrior who had led the group, whose name Elena had learned was Garrick, signaled to the gatekeepers, and the great doors began to swing open with a low groan of metal against stone. Elena stepped through into a courtyard far grander than anything she had expected, lit by rows of lanterns hanging from iron posts, the ground paved with smooth stone, worn soft by centuries of footsteps. "Wait here," Garrick instructed her, gesturing toward a bench near the entrance, while he and the woman warrior, whose name was Freya, moved ahead to inform the household of their unexpected guest. The third warrior remained beside Elena, watching her with cautious curiosity, but saying nothing. Elena sat carefully on the bench, suddenly aware of how strange she must look, a woman in a torn wedding gown, sitting alone in the courtyard of a castle belonging to a king, her own pack considered an enemy. She smoothed the ruined fabric across her lap and tried to steady her breathing, uncertain what kind of reception awaited her. She did not have to wait long. Within minutes, Garrick returned, his expression unreadable. "The king will see you now," he said simply. "Follow me." Elena rose from the bench and followed him through a set of tall wooden doors into the main hall of the castle. The space was enormous, lit by a massive fireplace at the far end, and rows of torches lining the stone walls. Tapestries depicting wolves running through snow-covered forests hung between the windows, and the ceiling arched high overhead, disappearing into shadow. At the far end of the hall, seated in a chair that seemed carved directly from dark wood rather than assembled, sat a man Elena had never seen before but somehow recognized instantly by the sheer presence he carried. King Cale Ashwood was younger than she had expected, perhaps only a few years older than herself, with sharp features and eyes the color of storm clouds that fixed on her the moment she entered the hall. His dark hair was cut short, and even seated, he carried himself with the kind of authority that filled the entire room. Elena stopped a respectful distance from the chair, unsure of the proper protocol for addressing a rival king, and simply inclined her head. "Your Majesty." Cale studied her for a long moment, his gaze traveling over the torn wedding gown, the dirt smudged across her skin, the exhaustion visible in her posture despite her attempt to stand tall. "My warriors tell me they found the intended bride of Alpha Daemon Kane wandering alone through my forests," he said finally, his voice deep and measured. "On what should have been her wedding day." "That is correct, Your Majesty," Elena replied, keeping her voice steady despite the way his gaze seemed to see straight through whatever composure she tried to maintain. "And why would the future wife of my greatest rival find herself alone in enemy territory, dressed for a ceremony that clearly never took place?" Cale leaned forward slightly in his chair, genuine curiosity mixing with something sharper in his expression. Elena took a breath, deciding once again that honesty served her better than evasion. "Because I discovered, less than an hour before the ceremony was set to begin, that Alpha Kane had been unfaithful to me with my own cousin. I chose not to marry a man who had already broken every promise he intended to make to me." Silence fell across the hall following her words. Somewhere behind her, Elena heard Garrick shift his weight, and she wondered if he was surprised by her bluntness in front of the king. Cale's expression, however, did not change dramatically. If anything, something flickered behind his storm-colored eyes that Elena could not quite identify. Perhaps surprise, perhaps something closer to interest. "That takes considerable courage," Cale said finally, "to walk away from a wedding attended by hundreds of guests, from an alliance that likely secured your family's position within his pack, rather than simply enduring the betrayal quietly, as many in your position might have chosen to do. I did not consider it courage, Elena said honestly. I considered it the only option that allowed me to continue respecting myself. Kale rose slowly from his chair, and Elena noticed for the first time just how tall he stood, his presence seeming to fill even the vast space of the great hall. He descended the few steps from his raised seat and approached her, stopping a respectful distance away, close enough to study her features clearly, but far enough to maintain proper distance between them. You understand, he said quietly, that you now stand within the territory of the man your former pack has spent nearly a decade calling their enemy. Many in your position might fear what consequences that could bring. I understand, Elena replied, meeting his gaze steadily despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of her body. But I also understand that your warriors could have left me alone in the forest to face whatever dangers waited there, and instead, they chose to bring me to safety. That tells me something about the kind of leadership you practice within your territory, regardless of what conflicts exist between our packs. Something shifted in Kale's expression at her words, and for a brief moment, Elena thought she saw the faintest hint of a smile pull at the corner of his mouth, before it disappeared behind his composed exterior once more. You will remain here tonight as my guest, Kale said, turning to address Garrick and the other warriors standing nearby. See that she has proper accommodations, clothing suited to her comfort, and anything else she requires. We will discuss the matter of her situation further in the morning, once she has had proper rest. Elena felt a wave of exhaustion crash over her at his words, as though her body had been waiting for permission to finally acknowledge how depleted she truly was. Thank you, Your Majesty, she said, inclining her head once more. Kale studied her for one final moment, before turning back toward his chair. Rest well, Elena Voss, he said, and Elena felt a small jolt of surprise that he already knew her full name, though she supposed news of Daemon Kane's wedding had likely reached every neighboring territory in the days leading up to the ceremony. Freya stepped forward to guide her from the hall, and Elena followed gratefully, her legs nearly giving out from the accumulated exhaustion of the day's events. As they walked through a series of corridors toward what Elena assumed would be guest quarters, she found herself reflecting on the strange turn her life had taken within the span of a single day. That morning, she had woken as the future wife of the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories. Now, as night fell completely over an unfamiliar castle, she found herself a guest within the walls of his greatest rival, uncertain what her future held, but strangely, for the first time since discovering Daemon's betrayal, not entirely afraid of whatever came next. Freya led her into a spacious guest chamber, warm from a fire already burning in the hearth, with a large bed covered in soft furs, and a wooden tub set near the fireplace, already filled with steaming water. The king ordered a bath prepared as soon as we brought word of your arrival, Freya explained, gesturing toward a set of clean clothing laid across a chair near the bed. There are garments there that should fit you reasonably well. I will have food brought up shortly. Elena thanked her sincerely, and once Freya had left the room, she allowed herself to finally release the tension she had been holding since the moment she opened that dressing room door. She sank into the warm water of the bath, letting it soothe the aches in her muscles from hours of walking, and allowed silent tears to fall freely, now that no one remained to witness her grief. She thought of her father, wondering how he had reacted to her sudden departure, whether he understood the reasons behind it, or simply felt confusion and worry about her safety. She thought of the pack elders, the guests, the celebration that had been meant to secure alliances between territories, now left in ruins because of choices made by people other than herself. Mostly, she thought about the strange kindness she had encountered within enemy walls, the unexpected gentleness in a king she had been raised to view as a threat, an adversary, someone to fear rather than trust. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, what conversations awaited her once morning arrived, what decisions she would need to make about her future now that the life she had planned for herself lay in ruins behind her. But for the first time since fleeing her own wedding, Elena felt something resembling safety settle over her, however fragile and uncertain it might prove to be. She finished her bath and dressed in the simple but well-made garments left for her, a soft tunic and trousers far more practical than the ruined wedding gown she had worn through hours of forest travel. When food arrived, brought by a quiet servant who introduced herself simply as Margaret, Elena ate gratefully, realizing she had not consumed anything since early that morning, before the entire disaster of her wedding day had unfolded. As she finally settled into the soft bed, surrounded by warmth and unexpected comfort within walls that belonged to her former fiancé's enemy, Elena found her mind returning again and again to the image of Cale Ashwood, rising from his chair to approach her, his storm-colored eyes studying her with something that felt less like judgment and more like genuine curiosity. She pushed the thought away, reminding herself firmly that exhaustion and emotional turmoil could easily distort perception, that whatever strange kindness she had witnessed tonight likely stemmed from political calculation rather than genuine character. Kings did not offer hospitality to abandoned brides without reason, and Elena understood well enough from years within pack politics that every kindness carried potential motive beneath its surface. Still, as sleep finally began pulling her under, Elena could not entirely dismiss the small, cautious flicker of hope that had begun to grow within her chest. Hope that perhaps her life was not truly over, but simply beginning a new and unexpected chapter she could not have predicted that morning, when she had first put on her wedding gown. Elena slept more deeply than she expected, given the chaos of the day behind her, and woke the following morning to sunlight streaming through the tall windows of her guest chamber. For a brief, disoriented moment, she forgot where she was, expecting to see the familiar walls of her childhood bedroom within her own pack's territory. Then memory returned in a rush, and she sat up quickly, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings of Frostmark Castle. A soft knock came at her door moments later, and Margaret entered, carrying a tray of breakfast along with fresh clothing, this time a simple but elegant dress in deep blue fabric that Elena assumed had been selected specifically for her. "The king requests your presence in his private study once you have eaten and dressed," Margaret informed her, setting the tray on a small table near the window. "There is no urgency. Take whatever time you require." Elena thanked her and ate slowly, using the quiet moments alone to gather her thoughts before whatever conversation awaited her with the king. She dressed carefully in the provided garment, finding it fit surprisingly well, and made her way through the castle corridors following directions Margaret had provided, her mind spinning with questions about what Cale intended to discuss with her. She found his study easily enough, a smaller room than the Great Hall but no less impressive, lined with shelves of books and maps depicting the various territories of the northern regions. Cale stood near one of the tall windows, looking out over the courtyard below, and turned when she entered. "You slept well, I hope," he said, gesturing toward a chair positioned near a large wooden desk. "Better than I expected, given the circumstances," Elena admitted, seating herself as he moved to sit across from her. Cale studied her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "I imagine you are wondering what happens next," he said finally. "Whether I intend to use your presence here as leverage against Daemon Kane, or whether I have some other purpose in offering you shelter." Elena appreciated his directness. "The thought had crossed my mind," she admitted. "I will be honest with you," Cale said, leaning back in his chair. "There is significant advantage in your presence here. Word of your departure from your own wedding has likely already spread across every territory in the north by now. Daemon Kane's reputation will suffer considerably, particularly once details of his betrayal become known. And your presence within my walls, whether I choose to make use of it politically or not, sends a clear message to him about the strength of my position relative to his own." Elena appreciated that he did not attempt to disguise his political calculations behind false sentiment. "And what do you intend to do with that advantage?" she asked. Cale's expression grew thoughtful, and for a long moment he said nothing, simply studying her with those storm-colored eyes that seemed to see far more than Elena felt comfortable revealing. "I have a proposal," he said finally, "though I suspect it may sound unusual given the circumstances." Elena straightened in her chair, curiosity overtaking her lingering exhaustion. "I am listening." "I propose a marriage between us," Cale said plainly, watching her reaction carefully. "Not a marriage born from affection, since we barely know one another, but a marriage of mutual advantage. You would gain protection, status, and a life free from the shame your former pack might attempt to place upon you for leaving your wedding. I would gain a queen whose very presence weakens Daemon Kane's standing among the northern packs, and strengthens my position considerably in any future negotiations, or conflicts between our territories. Elena sat in stunned silence for several moments, processing the enormity of what he had just suggested. A marriage, proposed within a single day of meeting, to a man she barely knew, ruler of a kingdom her own pack had considered an enemy for as long as she could remember. "You barely know me," she said finally, though even as she spoke the words, she found herself considering the proposal more seriously than she expected. "How can you be certain I would make a suitable queen for your territory?" "I know enough," Kale replied. "I know you walked away from wealth, status, and a powerful alliance rather than compromise your own dignity. I know you showed remarkable composure standing in my great hall last night, despite everything you had endured that day. And I know that whatever partnership we might build together, it would be built on honesty from the very beginning, rather than years of hidden betrayal like the one you just escaped." Elena considered his words carefully. There was something appealing in the honesty of his proposal, the lack of pretense about romantic feelings neither of them currently possessed for one another. After the devastating betrayal she had experienced only a day earlier, the idea of a partnership built on clear, practical terms rather than assumed emotional promises held unexpected appeal. "What would be expected of me as your queen?" she asked, deciding the question deserved serious consideration rather than immediate dismissal. "Partnership in matters of governance, when you feel prepared to take on such responsibilities," Kale answered. "Support in diplomatic matters, given your experience with negotiations from your time within Kane's pack, and genuine respect, which I intend to offer regardless of whatever affection may or may not develop between us over time." Elena studied him carefully, searching his expression for any sign of deception, any hint that his offer carried hidden motives beyond what he had already stated plainly. She found none, only steady, calm sincerity in his storm-colored eyes. "And if I refuse?" she asked. "Then you remain welcome within my territory, as a guest for as long as you require, until you decide upon whatever path you wish to take next," Kale said without hesitation. "This is not a demand, Elena. It is an offer, freely given, which you are entirely free to decline." The genuine lack of pressure in his voice struck Elena more than almost anything else that had happened since she fled her own wedding. Damon had always found subtle ways to pressure her decisions, framing his preferences as though they were inevitable conclusions she would naturally reach on her own. Kale offered none of that manipulation, simply laying out his proposal honestly and allowing her the space to consider it without coercion. "I need time to think," Elena said finally. "Of course," Kale replied, rising from his chair. "Take whatever time you require. My household is yours to explore, and my people have been instructed to assist you with anything you might need." Elena spent the remainder of that day walking through the castle grounds, observing the daily life of Frostmark territory with careful attention. She watched warriors training in the courtyard, children playing near the castle gardens, servants moving efficiently through their duties with none of the tension or fear she might have expected within enemy territory. Everything she observed suggested a well-managed kingdom, ruled by someone who commanded respect rather than fear from his people. By evening, as she sat alone in her guest chamber, watching the sun set over unfamiliar hills, Elena found herself weighing the practical realities of her situation. Returning to her former pack meant facing public humiliation, watching Damon marry her own cousin while pretending nothing had happened, living the remainder of her life as the woman who had been publicly rejected and betrayed. Remaining as a permanent guest within Frostmark offered safety, but no real purpose, no clear path forward for building a meaningful life. Marrying Kale offered something entirely different. Not romance, not the fairy tale ending she had once imagined for herself, but purpose, partnership, and perhaps most importantly, the satisfaction of watching Damon Kane witness her build a powerful new life directly within the walls of his greatest rival. The following morning, Elena requested another audience with Kale and found him once again in his private study, reviewing documents spread across his desk. "I have considered your proposal," she said, standing before him with newfound resolve steadying her voice. "I accept." Kale studied her for a long moment, and Elena thought she saw something that might have been genuine satisfaction flicker across his features before his composed expression returned. "Then we shall proceed with the arrangements," he said. I propose a small ceremony, held quickly, without the elaborate celebration your previous wedding required. Given the circumstances, I imagine you have little desire for another grand display. None whatsoever, Elena agreed, a small, tired smile pulling at the corner of her mouth, despite everything. Within a week, arrangements had been finalized. Elena stood once again in wedding attire, though this time, a simple gown far removed from the elaborate silk creation she had worn only days earlier, standing before a small gathering of Frostmark elders and warriors, rather than 300 guests from 4 territories. Kale stood beside her, dressed in formal attire befitting his station, and as the elder conducting the ceremony spoke the traditional words binding them together, Elena felt none of the nervous excitement she had experienced before her first attempted wedding, only calm, steady resolve. When the ceremony concluded, and Kale slipped a simple silver band onto her finger, sealing their union before witnesses, Elena felt something shift within her chest, not quite happiness, but something closer to relief. Whatever came next, she would face it as Queen of Frostmark, standing beside a partner who had offered her honesty from the very beginning of their arrangement. News of the marriage reached Daemon Kane's territory within hours, carried swiftly by messengers eager to share such significant political developments. Elena later learned, through servants who whispered about the reaction among traveling merchants, that Daemon had reportedly thrown a chair across his private chambers upon hearing the news, understanding immediately the humiliation such a union represented for his own standing among the northern packs. His runaway bride, the woman he had betrayed only days before their planned wedding, had become queen of his greatest rival's territory. Elena felt a small, private satisfaction at the thought, though she reminded herself firmly that revenge had not been her primary motivation in accepting Kale's proposal. She had chosen this path because it offered her dignity, purpose, and a chance to rebuild her life on terms she herself had negotiated, rather than terms imposed upon her by circumstances beyond her control. As she settled into her new role within Frostmark Castle in the weeks that followed, Elena began to understand that her decision, however impulsive it might have appeared to outside observers, had opened a door to a future she could never have anticipated only days earlier. Whatever challenges awaited her as queen of a territory, still technically at odds with her former pack, she felt ready to face them, guided by the quiet strength she had discovered within herself during the darkest hours following her original wedding's collapse. She did not yet know what her marriage to Kale would ultimately become, whether their practical arrangement might eventually deepen into something more genuine, or whether it would remain simply a partnership of mutual advantage as originally intended. But standing within the walls of her new home, wearing the silver band that marked her as Queen of Frostmark, Elena felt something she had not experienced since long before her original wedding day. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that her future belonged entirely to her own choices, rather than the expectations and betrayals of others. Back within the Northern Kane territory, chaos had settled over the pack in the days following Elena's dramatic departure. Daemon Kane found himself facing a crisis unlike anything he had encountered during his years as Alpha, his reputation crumbling as details of his betrayal spread among pack members and neighboring territories alike. The elders who had witnessed Elena's silent walk through the courtyard demanded answers, and Daemon found himself forced to explain, at least partially, the circumstances surrounding her sudden flight. He attempted to minimize his own culpability, framing the situation as a momentary lapse in judgment rather than months of ongoing betrayal, but Ivy's continued presence within the territory, and the obvious tension between them whenever they appeared together publicly, told a different story to anyone paying attention. Within 2 weeks of Elena's departure, pressured by elders concerned about the pack's stability and reputation among neighboring territories, Daemon announced his intention to marry Ivy instead, framing the union as evidence of genuine commitment rather than simply damage control following a very public scandal. The wedding, when it finally took place, carried none of the grandeur or celebration that had been planned for his union with Elena. Fewer guests attended, and those who did whispered quietly among themselves throughout the ceremony, exchanging knowing glances whenever Daemon and Ivy stood together at the altar. Ivy, for her part, seemed determined to prove herself worthy of the position she had claimed through such controversial means, throwing herself into pack duties with an intensity that some elders found admirable and others found suspicious. But beneath the surface of her newfound status, cracks began appearing almost immediately. Ivy struggled with the political complexities of pack leadership that Elena had spent years mastering, making decisions that frustrated experienced advisors and created tension among pack members accustomed to Elena's steady guidance. Damon, distracted by mounting political pressure from neighboring territories eager to exploit his weakened standing, found himself increasingly frustrated with his new wife's inexperience, occasionally comparing her unfavorably to Elena in moments of private irritation that Ivy overheard more often than he realized. The comparison stung deeply, feeding a growing resentment within Ivy that she carefully hid behind a composed public exterior. She had wanted this life, had wanted Damon's love and the status that came with being his wife, but she had not anticipated the constant, unspoken comparison to the cousin she had betrayed, nor had she anticipated how quickly Damon's affection seemed to cool once the initial excitement of their secret relationship faded into the daily realities of shared leadership responsibilities. Meanwhile, news continued arriving from Frostmark territory about Elena's new life as queen, each report seeming to highlight her growing competence and popularity among Kael's people. Merchants who traveled between territories spoke of Elena's involvement in resolving trade disputes, her thoughtful contributions to diplomatic negotiations, her genuine warmth toward common citizens who approached her with concerns or requests for assistance. Each piece of news reached Damon like a fresh wound, reminding him constantly of what he had lost through his own careless betrayal. He found himself growing increasingly obsessed with reports of Elena's success, unable to reconcile the image of his former fiancée thriving within enemy territory with his own increasingly troubled marriage and weakened political standing among the northern packs. Ivy noticed his preoccupation, and rather than addressing it directly, she began to feel a growing sense of desperation about securing her own position within the pack. If Damon's affection had already begun wavering only weeks into their marriage, she understood she would need to find other ways to solidify her status before that wavering affection disappeared entirely, leaving her vulnerable within a pack that had never fully accepted her as their leader's rightful wife. The seeds of future conflict had been planted, though neither Damon nor Ivy fully understood yet how dramatically those seeds would eventually grow, nor how completely their choices would ultimately shape the confrontation that lay ahead between their weakened pack and the increasingly powerful union Elena had built within Frostmark territory. Within Frostmark Castle, Elena found herself settling into a rhythm of life she could never have predicted only weeks earlier. Her days filled with genuine purpose, meeting with advisors to discuss trade agreements, sitting in on council sessions where territorial disputes with smaller neighboring settlements were resolved through careful negotiation rather than conflict, and gradually earning the trust of Frostmark citizens who had initially regarded their new queen with cautious curiosity. Kael proved to be nothing like the reputation her own pack had constructed around him over years of territorial rivalry. Where Damon's pack had described him as ruthless and cold, calculating in his pursuit of power, Elena discovered instead a leader who listened carefully to his advisors, who visited common households within his territory to understand their concerns directly rather than relying solely on reports from officials, and who treated every member of his household, from the highest-ranking warrior to the youngest kitchen servant, with genuine respect. Their arrangement, initially built purely on practical advantage, began shifting slowly into something Elena had not anticipated when she first accepted his proposal. She found herself looking forward to their shared evening meals, when Kael would ask about her day's activities with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than polite obligation. She found herself seeking his opinion on matters of governance, appreciating his thoughtful perspective and the way he never dismissed her ideas simply because she was new to leadership within his territory. One evening, several weeks into their marriage, Elena found Kael in the castle gardens after a particularly difficult council session involving a dispute between two farming families over water rights. She had handled the negotiation herself, drawing on skills developed during years within her former pack, and had successfully brokered a compromise that satisfied both parties. But the process had left her mentally exhausted. "You handled that situation with remarkable skill," Kael said, looking up from where he sat near a small fountain as she approached. "I heard reports from several advisors who were quite impressed." Elena felt a small warmth spread through her chest at his praise, genuine in a way that felt different from the calculated compliments she had grown accustomed to during her years within Damon's pack. "Thank you," she said, settling onto the bench beside him. It felt good to use those skills for something meaningful again. "You have a gift for understanding people," Cale observed, studying her with those storm-colored eyes that Elena had begun noticing seemed to soften slightly whenever they spoke privately, away from the formal expectations of court life. It is a rare quality among leaders, the ability to see genuine solutions rather than simply asserting authority. Elena found herself smiling at his words, surprised by how much his opinion had come to matter to her over the past weeks. "I learned that skill through necessity," she admitted. "Growing up within a pack that valued strength above almost everything else, I discovered early that careful negotiation often achieved more than confrontation." They sat together in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the last light of evening fade behind the castle walls, and Elena found herself acutely aware of Cale's presence beside her, the warmth radiating from him despite the cool evening air, the steady, calm energy that seemed to surround him at all times. "I want you to know," Cale said finally, breaking the silence, "that whatever this arrangement began as, I have found myself genuinely grateful for your presence here. Not simply for the political advantages our union provides, but for you, specifically, as a person." Elena turned to look at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his admission. "I feel the same way," she said honestly. "I did not expect to find genuine friendship within this arrangement, but I am grateful for it." Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of feelings neither had explicitly planned for when they first agreed to their practical marriage of convenience. Cale reached over slowly, taking her hand in his, and Elena did not pull away, feeling instead a warmth spread through her at the simple contact. "I do not wish to pressure you into anything beyond what feels genuine," Cale said quietly, "but I find myself hoping that what we are building together might eventually become something more than simply a political arrangement." Elena felt her heart beat faster at his words, surprised by how much she wanted the same thing. How completely different this quiet, honest moment felt from anything she had experienced during her years with Damon. "I would like that too," she admitted softly. From that evening forward, their relationship shifted gradually into something warmer and more genuine, though neither rushed the process, both understanding the importance of building trust naturally rather than forcing emotions before they were ready to bloom. Elena found herself falling into an unexpected happiness within Frostmark territory, discovering in Cale a partner who valued her intelligence, her strength, and her genuine character, rather than simply her usefulness in political calculations. Meanwhile, tensions within Damon's territory continued escalating. His marriage to Ivy had grown increasingly strained, marked by frequent disagreements over pact decisions and a growing undercurrent of resentment that both attempted to hide behind public displays of unity. Ivy, desperate to secure her position within a pack that had never fully accepted her leadership, began making increasingly bold decisions without consulting Damon or the pack elders, decisions that created further instability within their already weakened territory. Reports continued reaching Damon about Elena's flourishing life within Frostmark, each piece of news feeding a growing bitterness that he could not fully suppress, despite understanding, on some level, that his own choices had led directly to this outcome. He began to view Elena's happiness not simply as evidence of her own resilience, but as a personal affront, as though her success within enemy territory represented an ongoing insult to his own diminished status among the northern packs. This growing resentment, combined with mounting pressure from pack elders, concerned about Frostmark's increasing influence and strength under Elena's guidance alongside Cale, eventually convinced Damon that he needed to take action. He began quietly gathering support among sympathetic pack members and neighboring territories still loyal to old grievances against Frostmark, constructing an argument that his marriage to Elena had never been properly dissolved, and that her subsequent union with Cale therefore represented an illegitimate claim that threatened the stability of alliances throughout the northern territories. It was a desperate, calculated move, born more from wounded pride and political desperation than any genuine legal standing, but Damon understood that within the complex political landscape of pack territories, even a weak claim, pursued aggressively enough, could create significant complications for his rivals. He began planning a confrontation, one he intended to bring directly to Frostmark's borders, determined to reclaim what he viewed as rightfully his, regardless of the reality that Elena had left him freely, choosing her own path forward, rather than being taken from him against her will. Word of Daemon's growing hostility and gathering forces eventually reached Frostmark through trusted informants within the Northern Territories, and Elena found herself facing the difficult realization that her past was not as fully behind her as she had hoped. Whatever peace and happiness she had discovered within her new life, it seemed Daemon remained unwilling to simply let her go, his wounded pride demanding some form of confrontation that Elena had genuinely hoped to avoid. She discussed the growing threat with Chaol late one evening in his private study, both of them poring over reports detailing the size and movement of forces Daemon had begun assembling near the shared border between their territories. "He cannot genuinely believe he has legitimate claim to reclaim you," Chaol said, frustration evident in his voice as he studied the reports spread across his desk. "You left freely, before any vows were spoken. There is no binding agreement between you that could possibly justify this kind of aggression." "Wounded pride rarely concerns itself with legal legitimacy," Elena replied, though she could not fully suppress the anxiety building within her at the thought of facing Daemon again, particularly under such volatile circumstances. He wants to prove something to himself, and to the other pack leaders watching his continued decline in influence. My return, willing or otherwise, would represent a significant restoration of his damaged reputation. Chaol reached across the desk, taking her hand in his, with the same gentle reassurance he had offered many times over the past months of their genuine partnership. "Whatever happens, know that I will stand beside you through this confrontation. You are not facing him alone, not anymore." Elena felt gratitude wash through her at his steady presence, so different from the isolation she had felt during her final days within Daemon's pack, when she had discovered his betrayal completely alone, with no one standing beside her to offer support or protection. "We should prepare our own forces," she said, pushing aside her anxiety and focusing instead on practical strategy, the same skills that had served her well throughout her years within pack politics. "If Daemon intends to bring this conflict to our border, we cannot appear unprepared or vulnerable." Chaol nodded, already reaching for additional maps and reports. "Agreed, but I also believe there may be a path forward that avoids direct conflict entirely, if we approach this confrontation with the right strategy." They spent the following days preparing carefully, gathering intelligence about the exact nature and size of Daemon's assembled forces, consulting with trusted advisors about the political implications of various possible responses, and developing a plan that would allow Elena to face her former fiancé directly, on her own terms, rather than simply reacting defensively to whatever aggression he intended to bring to their border. Elena found herself surprised by how calm she felt as preparations continued, understanding that whatever confrontation awaited her, she would face it not as the woman who had fled her wedding in devastated silence, but as Queen of Frostmark, standing beside a partner who genuinely respected and supported her, backed by a territory that had welcomed her with far more warmth and trust than her own former pack had ever truly offered. The confrontation, when it finally arrived, would test everything Elena had built since that devastating morning when she had opened a dressing room door and discovered the depth of Daemon's betrayal. But she felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, secure in the knowledge that she had already survived the worst betrayal of her life, and emerged stronger, wiser, and surrounded by people who valued her for exactly who she was. The morning Daemon's forces reached the border between Frostmark and Kane territory, the sky hung heavy with gray clouds that seemed to mirror the tension building across the contested land. Elena stood at Chaol's side atop the fortified wall, overlooking the border crossing, watching as a formation of warriors bearing the Kane pack crest assembled in the distance, Daemon himself visible at their center, mounted and dressed in formal battle armor that seemed designed more for intimidation than actual combat. "He wants a spectacle," Chaol observed quietly beside her, his sharp eyes studying the assembled forces with careful calculation. "Notice how he positioned himself where our watchers would see him clearly. This is theater as much as genuine confrontation." Elena nodded, understanding the truth in his observation. Damon had always possessed a talent for dramatic gestures, for creating moments that would be remembered and discussed throughout the Northern Territories long after they concluded. His current display, however, felt less like the confident showmanship she remembered from their years together and more like desperate posturing from a man whose position had grown increasingly unstable. "I want to speak with him directly," Elena said, turning to look at Cale with steady resolve. "Not from behind these walls, but face to face, where he cannot hide behind theater and exaggeration." Cale studied her for a long moment, concern evident in his expression despite his obvious respect for her judgment. "It could be dangerous. We do not fully know his intentions, whether he comes seeking genuine confrontation or simply attempting to provoke a reaction he can use politically." "I understand the risk," Elena replied, "but I have spent months building strength within these walls, learning to trust my own voice again after years of feeling silenced within his pack. I need to face him directly, on my own terms, to finally close this chapter of my life completely." Cale nodded slowly, respecting her decision even as his protective instincts clearly urged caution. "Then I will stand beside you," he said firmly. "Whatever happens, you will not face him alone." Together, they descended from the castle walls and rode out toward the border crossing, accompanied by a small but carefully selected group of Frostmark's most trusted warriors, enough to demonstrate strength without appearing to seek unnecessary conflict. As they approached the neutral ground between the two territories, Elena felt her heart pounding, but her hands remained steady on the reins, her posture composed despite the significance of the moment approaching. Damon rode forward to meet them, flanked by several of his own warriors, his expression shifting through visible surprise and something that might have been reluctant admiration as he took in Elena's transformed appearance. Gone was the devastated bride who had fled through the forest in a torn wedding gown. In her place sat a confident queen, dressed in fine but practical riding attire befitting her new status, her posture radiating the kind of quiet authority that came from genuine self-respect, rather than performed confidence. "Elena," Damon said, his voice carrying across the space between them, "you look well." "I am well," Elena replied evenly. "Better than I have been in years, in fact." Damon's jaw tightened at her steady response, clearly not the reaction he had anticipated or hoped for. "I have come to discuss the matter of our unfinished union," he said, his voice carrying an edge of forced authority. "The vows between us were never properly dissolved before you entered into this arrangement with Ashwood." "There were no vows spoken between us at all," Elena replied, her voice remaining calm despite the absurdity of his claim. "I left before the ceremony began, Damon. You know this as well as I do. There is no binding agreement between us to dissolve, because no such agreement was ever formed. The engagement itself carried certain expectations, certain obligations recognized across pack law," Damon insisted, though Elena could hear the desperation creeping into his voice as his argument grew increasingly weak under her direct challenge. Cale spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the calm authority of a king accustomed to commanding respect through reason rather than intimidation. "Pack law recognizes formal engagement contracts, properly witnessed and signed by all relevant parties. I have reviewed the documentation from your original arrangement with Elena, Alpha Kane. No such formal contract exists between you, only a verbal understanding that carries no binding legal weight under any territory's established laws." Damon's face flushed with obvious frustration, understanding that his legal argument, weak from the beginning, had just been thoroughly dismantled before witnesses from both territories. "This is not simply about legal technicalities," he said, his composure beginning to crack. "Elena belongs with her own kind, within her own pack, not married to the leader of a rival territory that has caused our people nothing but conflict for generations. I belong wherever I choose to build my life," Elena replied firmly, feeling a surge of strength rise within her chest as she finally spoke the words she had needed to say for months. "You do not have the right to determine where I belong, Damon. You lost that right the moment I found you with my cousin, the moment you chose to betray every promise you had ever made to me." The assembled warriors on both sides fell silent, watching the confrontation unfold with evident tension. Elena continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I have built a genuine life here, within Frostmark territory, surrounded by people who value me for who I am, rather than simply what I can provide politically. My marriage to Kale began as a practical arrangement, yes, but it has grown into something real, something built on honesty and mutual respect from the very beginning. I will not abandon that life to satisfy your wounded pride, or to help you salvage a reputation that your own choices damaged beyond repair. Damon opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a commotion arose among his own assembled warriors. Elena watched as several exchanged uncertain glances, clearly troubled by the public nature of this confrontation and the increasingly obvious weakness of their alpha's position. Alpha Kane, one of his senior warriors, said quietly but firmly, "Perhaps this confrontation was ill-advised. The Queen's position appears legally sound, and continuing to press this claim publicly only further damages our pack's standing among the Northern Territories." Damon's face grew increasingly red as he realized the extent to which his own warriors were beginning to question his judgment openly, in front of representatives from a rival territory no less. Whatever authority he had hoped to demonstrate through this confrontation was crumbling rapidly before witnesses whose respect he desperately needed to maintain. "There is something else you should know, Alpha Kane," Elena said, deciding the moment had arrived to address the deeper issue underlying his desperate actions. "Your pack's continued instability stems not from my absence, but from choices you made long before I ever discovered your betrayal. Ivy's inexperience with leadership, your own diminished credibility following such public scandal, these problems exist independently of anything happening within Frostmark territory. Confronting me here today will not solve those underlying issues." Damon's expression shifted through several emotions, anger giving way gradually to something that looked almost like genuine defeat as the reality of his situation settled over him fully, witnessed by warriors from both territories, and impossible to disguise or minimize any longer. "This is not over," he said finally, though his voice carried none of the earlier authority he had attempted to project. "It is over, Damon," Elena replied gently but firmly. "It has been over since the moment I walked out of that dressing room. I wish you well in resolving whatever difficulties remain within your own pack, but my future lies here, within Frostmark, beside a partner who has never once given me reason to doubt his honesty or commitment." Damon stared at her for a long moment, and Elena watched something finally settle within his expression, a grudging acceptance that no further argument or posturing would change the reality of the situation before him. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode back toward his own territory, his warriors following behind him, several exchanging glances that suggested growing doubts about his continued leadership. As the Kane forces retreated across the border, Elena felt a profound sense of release settle over her, as though a weight she had carried for months had finally lifted completely from her shoulders. She turned to look at Kale, who was watching her with obvious pride and admiration. "You handled that with remarkable strength," he said quietly, reaching over to take her hand. "I finally said everything I needed to say," Elena replied, feeling tears of relief rather than sadness gathering at the corners of her eyes. "For months, I have carried the memory of that betrayal quietly, working to build a new life without fully confronting what happened. Today, I finally reclaimed my own voice completely." They rode back toward Frostmark Castle together, the small group of warriors following behind them in respectful silence, understanding they had witnessed something significant, a queen claiming her own authority and dignity before witnesses from both territories, closing a painful chapter of her past with strength and clarity rather than fear or hesitation. Word of the confrontation spread quickly throughout the Northern Territories in the days that followed, and the story that emerged painted a clear picture for anyone paying attention. Damon Kane had traveled to a rival's border, attempting to reclaim a woman who had left him freely, only to be firmly and eloquently rejected before witnesses from both territories, his weak legal arguments dismantled, and his pack's internal instability exposed publicly for the first time. Within his own territory, the fallout proved significant. Pack elders, already concerned about Damon's judgment following the original wedding scandal, grew increasingly vocal about their doubts regarding his continued leadership. Ivy, watching her husband's authority crumble further with each passing week, found herself facing growing isolation within a pack that had never fully accepted her, now compounded by Damon's obvious diminished standing among neighboring territories. Within months, Facing mounting pressure from elders and declining support among pack members, increasingly disillusioned with his leadership, Daemon found his authority as alpha seriously challenged, ultimately leading to a formal transition of leadership that removed him from his position entirely, replaced by a council of elders determined to restore stability and credibility to their weakened pack. Ivy, without the protection of Daemon's authority, found herself with no clear place within the reorganized pack structure. Her earlier betrayal of Elena now widely known and discussed openly among pack members who had come to view her with distrust and quiet contempt. She eventually left the territory entirely, seeking a fresh start elsewhere, far from the consequences of choices that had cost her everything she had originally hoped to gain. Within Frostmark territory, life continued to flourish for Elena and Chaol in the months following the border confrontation. News of Daemon's downfall reached them gradually, carried through trusted messengers and traveling merchants who moved between the northern territories, and while Elena felt no particular satisfaction in his misfortune, she recognized a quiet sense of closure in knowing that the consequences of his choices had finally caught up with him fully. Her relationship with Chaol continued deepening naturally, moving beyond the practical arrangement that had originally brought them together into something Elena recognized, with growing certainty, as genuine love. He supported her fully in her growing role as queen, encouraging her contributions to governance and diplomacy, while never once making her feel as though her opinions mattered less than his own. Their partnership, built initially on mutual advantage, had transformed into a genuine union of equals, each bringing complementary strengths to the leadership of their shared territory. One evening, nearly a year after Elena's dramatic arrival within Frostmark territory, she found herself standing once again in the castle gardens where Chaol had first admitted his growing feelings for her. The autumn air carried a crisp chill, and stars had begun appearing across the darkening sky above the castle walls. "Do you ever think about that day?" Chaol asked, joining her beside the fountain where they had shared so many meaningful conversations over the past year. "The day my warriors found you wandering through the forest?" Elena smiled, considering his question thoughtfully. "Often," she admitted. "Though the memory no longer carries the pain it once did, I think of it now as the beginning of everything meaningful in my life, rather than simply the ending of something painful." Chaol reached for her hand, his expression warm with genuine affection that had grown steadily over their year together. "I am grateful, every single day, that Daemon Kane proved unworthy of you," he said. "His loss became my greatest gain." Elena laughed softly, leaning against him with the comfortable ease that had developed between them over months of genuine partnership. "I have found, through everything that happened, that sometimes our greatest devastations lead us toward paths we could never have imagined choosing for ourselves. I never would have found this life, this happiness, if Daemon had remained faithful to our original engagement." "Do you regret any of it?" Chaol asked quietly. "The pain of that discovery, the difficult journey through unfamiliar forest, the uncertainty of arriving as a stranger within enemy territory?" Elena considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret the pain, certainly. I regret the betrayal that caused it, but I do not regret the path that pain ultimately led me toward. I found here, within Frostmark, a life built on genuine respect and honest partnership, something I never truly possessed during my years with Daemon, even before I discovered his betrayal completely." They stood together in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching stars continue emerging across the darkening sky, and Elena felt profound gratitude settle over her. Gratitude for the strength she had discovered within herself during her darkest moment. Gratitude for the unexpected kindness she had received from strangers, who became her chosen family. And gratitude for the genuine love she had ultimately found with a man she had once been taught to fear as an enemy. In the years that followed, Elena and Chaol's partnership continued strengthening, their combined leadership bringing genuine prosperity and stability to Frostmark territory. Elena's diplomatic skills, honed through years of pack politics and refined further through her genuine care for the well-being of Frostmark's citizens, helped forge lasting peace agreements with several neighboring territories that had previously maintained tense relationships with Chaol's kingdom. The old rivalry between Frostmark and the Kane pack gradually faded into distant history as the reorganized Kane leadership, focused on rebuilding their own damaged reputation and stability, chose diplomatic engagement over the old grudges and border tensions that had defined relations between the two territories for generations. Elena occasionally received word of developments within her former pack, information that no longer carried the emotional weight it once might have, simply distant news about a life she had left behind completely. She often thought, during quiet moments of reflection, about the strange, winding path her life had taken from that devastating morning when she opened a dressing room door and discovered a betrayal that shattered everything she believed about her future. She thought about the courage it had taken to walk away from that betrayal rather than simply enduring it quietly, and the deeper courage it had required to trust an uncertain future within enemy territory rather than retreating into the safety of familiar disappointment. Most of all, she thought about the genuine happiness she had ultimately found, not despite the devastating betrayal that began her journey, but in many ways because of it, because that painful discovery had forced her to reconsider everything she believed about love, loyalty, and the kind of life she truly deserved to build for herself. Elena Voss had arrived within Frostmark territory as a broken bride, wearing the torn remnants of a wedding gown meant for a marriage built on hidden betrayal. She had left that identity behind completely, transformed through genuine partnership and hard-won self-respect, into Queen Elena of Frostmark, ruler beside a husband who had earned her trust through consistent honesty rather than empty promises, respected by citizens who had come to love her for her genuine care and wisdom, and finally, completely at peace with the unexpected path that had led her toward a life far richer and more meaningful than anything she could have imagined on that original wedding morning, standing alone in a dressing room, unaware that her entire future was about to change forever. The story of the runaway bride who found unexpected love within enemy walls became something of a legend throughout the Northern Territories in the years that followed, told and retold among pack members and travelers alike. A story about the courage required to walk away from betrayal and the unexpected rewards that sometimes wait for those brave enough to choose their own path forward, regardless of how uncertain or frightening that path might initially appear. Elena herself rarely spoke of those events publicly, preferring instead to focus on the genuine work of governance and partnership that filled her days within Frostmark territory. But on quiet evenings, when she and Kale found themselves alone together, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point, she would sometimes smile softly and remark that she owed her greatest happiness, strangely enough, to the very betrayal that had once seemed like the ending of everything she valued. It had not been an ending at all. It had been the beginning of the truest, most genuine chapter of her entire life, built on foundations far stronger than the ones she had originally planned to build with Damon Kane, foundations of honesty, mutual respect, and love freely chosen rather than simply assumed. And within the walls of Frostmark Castle, surrounded by a kingdom that had welcomed her as their own, Elena Voss finally understood what genuine belonging truly meant, not simply a place determined by birth or original expectation, but a life built deliberately, choice by choice, with people who valued her completely for exactly who she was.